Okay, so I watched the second part to the how electricity began. To begin, Francis Hauksbee became the new head of demonstrations. Hauksbee tried to stamp his personality on his weekly meetings, producing ever more spectacular experiments. This was just to impress the bosses and get up in the hierarchy, I guess you could say. In November, he came up with a rotating glass sphere. He was able to remove the air from it using a new machine called the air pump. It involved a silk handkerchief, and when he touched the ball, a blue ethereal light came from the inside when he touched it. And back then this was seen as a really big thing, even though it doesn't really seem like it, just because things like that, like when he touched it and the light came in the middle, that was seen as like an act that only could be done by God, like to other people. Even Hauksbee didn't realize that his experiment started an electrical revolution, just because it was the first thing they seen. It was like, man can do this, you know. Before Hauksbee, electricity was merely a curiosity. His invention coincided with the birth of a new movement, the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was just like a movement where everyone began to be enlightened about all the things around. Enlightened people or individuals used reason to question the world and their legacy, which was the radical politics, art, and natural philosophy, which is the science of it all. Hauksbee's invention wasn't welcomed by these individuals, and then a scientist, or electrician I guess you could say, did a experiment using Hauksbee's invention, and then it was more welcomed into that environment. To continue, Benjamin Franklin, as we all know, one of our founding fathers, he experimented with lightning and his kite, and a wine bottle, it says. He proved that the idea that electricity in the sky was the same as electricity being made by man. Some men began testing electricity on animals. This was Galwani, and he used a frog. He used Hauksbee's invention to generate electrostatic charge that would accumulate and travel along the arm and out through a copper wire. Then he connected the charge wire to the frog's leg, and the frog's leg twitched. And then he called this animal electricity, and then a lot of scientists began to debuttle the name, I guess, and just saying it was regular electricity, just with animals, you know. But he thought he was coming up with something new, and not really. So then there was a professor that came up with an invention that is the most significant of the 18th century. The professor's name was Peter van Munchenbroek. I'm just gonna call him Peter because I don't want to. But Peter was born into the academy. His breakthrough came not because of his rare science, but because of a simple human mistake. He was trying to find a way to store electrical charge ready for his demonstrations. If electricity is a fluid that flows a bit like water, then maybe you can store it in the same way you can store water. So Peter went to his laboratory to try and make a device to store electricity. Peter started to think literally, and he took a glass jar and poured some water in it. He then placed inside it a length of conducting wire, and the wire was connected to a electric machine. Then he put the jar on an insulator to keep the charge in the jar, and then he tried to pour the electricity into the jar produced by the machine, by the wire, down through into the water. The charge just wouldn't stay in the jar. Then one day, by accident, he forgot to put the jar on the insulator and charged it instead while it was still in his hand. Finally, holding up the jar with one hand, he touched the top of the other and received an electrical shock, as you know, because water and electricity don't mix. He was almost thrown to the ground. He writes, "It's a new but terrible experiment," and he advised no one to ever try it. And the sheer power of the electricity which flew from the jar was greater than any seen before, and even more surprisingly, the jar could store that electricity for hours, even days. So that just meant after the electricity was in the jar, when he went back and touched it again, it still shocked him. He made his discovery, and he called it the Leyden jar. And the fame swept across the world very rapidly from 1745 to the rest of the 1740s. They called it the J jar, more modern name for it. But yeah, so he just got a jar of electrical fluid, and it turns out that you get a bigger shock from the jar if you allow the electric fluid to drain away from the earth. And this was just bits and pieces of what I picked up from the video.